Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Refinitiv, for inviting us to talk on this topic. Consensus Economics was founded in 1989 to collect and publish economic forecasts as a tool for understanding the economic outlook, with the consensus being a simple arithmetic mean average of the forecasts. Our first exhibit shows our United States panel. Our mission remains unchanged since the beginning of our work, which is to deliver to clients quality forecast information obtained from rigorous surveys of independent private sector forecasters. So you've got our United States panel here from our June survey, which was completed just this current week. The snapshot of the United States panel shows the forecasters listed in descending order of their current 2020 GDP growth forecasts. So you've got the optimists at the top of the list and the more pessimistic forecasts for 2020 at the bottom. These are expressed, of course, as economists do, in terms of the percent change in real GDP of 2020 over last year, 2019. You'll see right away that the panel contains quite a diverse group of forecasters, with the large banks like Citigroup, Royal Bank of Canada, Goldman Sachs, and Wells Fargo, together with a number of academic institutions. You've got the University of Maryland, Michigan, and at the bottom, Georgia State. Along with them, you've got some consultancies and a few specialized firms who are facing the housing market, namely Fannie Mae and the National Association of Home Builders. So home construction is part of their knowledge base. This is a series of variables, including, as I say, GDP in the first column and a couple of measures of inflation further on to the right. On the next page, we've got forecasts for government budget deficits, interest rates, and further on in the publication is exchange rates. I hope you've each been sent a copy of this June survey, and we hope you'll find it interesting. The graphic curves on the right-hand side show the progression of the consensus for United States GDP in blue and for United States consumer price inflation in red during the roughly 16 months since last summer. Clearly, the shock of the coronavirus and its impact on the United States economy is very visible in the progress of the blue line. This is unprecedented in 30 years of collecting this kind of data, and the speed and depth of the decline is, as I say, without precedent. Similarly, it's interesting to see that the inflation pattern has also been affected by this, as people begin to think that the current depression in active output will adversely affect prices of goods in the market basket of data. One of our panelists quoted it to us, and we've reproduced that in the box at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. He says that this is the hardest time at any point in his lifetime to forecast the economy, not only because of uncertainty about the direction of that economy, but about how it will affect the data outputs of the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States. The next exhibit 2 is an example of one of our survey questionnaires, which we send to our panels for each month. This happens to be for Canada, and as you can see, it shows the variables that we choose, which the Canadian panelists then provide us with their estimates for in the Excel spreadsheet cells. The variables are very precisely defined, so it's not just industrial production, it's industrial production on a GDP basis by industry with chained 2012 prices. The purpose of this is to try to make certain that all of our forecasters are providing us with their estimates on the same basis and that we don't have a mixture of apples and oranges. We have survey forms such as this for which we send to about 1,000 panelists covering 60 countries or so. And the precise definitions are extremely helpful in reducing disparities between the individual estimates. The survey schedule is in the upper right-hand corner, and we sent out the forms last week and received most of the responses on Monday of this week. We then go through a process which we call check and challenge, where we verify every number we've received and challenge those which are astray of what we think they should be. The next graph shows a number of academic studies that have been done. For more than 50 years, people have been looking at the consensus and have been wondering about its effectiveness and its accuracy in describing the economies. And so in 1987, a Federal Reserve executive from Boston called Stephen McNeese wrote, "Many have remarked on the fact that a consensus forecast, in other words, the mean of individual forecasts, is more accurate than most, or sometimes even all of the individual forecasts that constitute the mean." Then we've got a quote from Scott Armstrong. His book is at the right, just behind me. And obviously in the third one, Jim O'Neill and his group at Goldman Sachs Asset Management have done a fair amount of work on this particular area as well. Bob Jones did a piece in the Journal of Portfolio Management, and this quotes him as saying, "At least since the publication of a combination of forecasts by Bates and Granger in 1969, economists have known that combining individual forecasts from different sources can both improve accuracy and reduce forecast error. In the intervening years, numerous studies have confirmed these conclusions, outlined conditions under which forecast combinations are most effective, and tried to explain why simple equal weights work so well relative to more sophisticated statistical techniques." The next graph shows the way the historical data lays out. And what we've shown here is the consensus mean data for gross domestic product for the United States since 1991. And you'll see that each of these lines covers approximately 24 individual data points. And so we've got the individual consensus data from January of T-1 right through the 2 years that we collect the data and ending in December of T. And just after the December of T plot, you'll see a little delta shape, which shows the actual outturns. And so you can see how close the outturns as measured by the BEA were to the consensus forecasts and their progression through time. Goldman Sachs, in their work on this area, came to the conclusion that the use of consensus economic data to construct a monthly series starting in 1990 was what they wished to do. And they developed this data set of averages in order to show the changes in growth estimates over the years just around the actual year in question. They say we then used a 12-month average to construct an oscillator that measures whether the consensus growth views have been trending up or down over the period. And they found some useful trends within that, which allowed them to conclude at one stage that GDP growth estimates help predict equity returns. Today, the various firms, including a number of systematic quantitative investment managers, are using this kind of data in their modeling work. And investment management consultants as well. There's an interesting article that has just appeared in today's Financial Times. The headline is, "Bad things start to happen when finance front runs the economy." That's obviously speaking about the tremendous rally that the United States and other stock markets have had since March. We don't show the 2020 data on here because, in fact, it fell off the chart. That curve shows up in Exhibit 1, which we've looked at, and the United States GDP growth estimates for this year. The consensus is now at 5.6%. The next exhibit shows that interest in our work has actually helped and was widened over the years and has enabled us to develop a series of expandable databases. Much of this data is available on Refinitiv, including the 4 regional modules in the upper left-hand side, as well as the long-term forecast data. As we complete our weekly, monthly, and quarterly data products, we like to think that we are supporting the work of analysts and researchers worldwide. Claire.
Hi there. The exhibit in front of you is Exhibit 6, and we wanted to look at what the data was currently telling us about the G7 and the rest of the world. And so we're asking the question where and when we will see a recovery. And the first chart, the first bar chart, really just shows the 2020 real GDP consensus forecasts published yesterday for a selection of countries, G7, Western Europe. And as you can see, Italy, with a forecast of minus 10.7%, has by far the deepest decline. France is next with minus 9.7, and it just goes on through to Japan, minus 5.3, and a world aggregate of minus 4.7. The chart below is, well, we have netted out the 2020 GDP forecast, or the decline, against the 2021 GDP gain. And this shows the sort of combined 2-year totals. And this net negative qualifies, in our view, as a depression, hence the title of this presentation. But it's clear, you can see that Italy will not recoup its loss in GDP of this year, next year, or at least is not expected to. So the loss of output and the difficulty in recovering that output momentum has big negative implications for a lot of countries, Europe and North America, as shown here, because the impact is on growth and employment and future growth. So the weaker future growth is, the more difficult it is to rebound and to go back to pre-crisis levels or 2019 standards of living. The loss of output triggers loss in investment spending and loss in productive capacity. So if later growth cannot make up that lost ground, it means that machinery is less likely to be upgraded, hiring is cut back, and it can lead to what Alvin Hansen in the 1930s and Lawrence Summers in 2013 termed secular stagnation. So as low growth environments become more entrenched, it becomes harder for economies and sectors to recover their dynamism and their ability to modernize. And currently we have a government lockdown, or a sort of partially lifting lockdown, significant negative growth, as can be seen in the purple bars, which are going down, trade protectionism, geopolitical tensions, and this is having a brutal impact on most of the economies that we cover. So the next slide, really we wanted to ask the question, how soon can the level of output lost during the COVID depression be regained? And we had a look at quarterly forecast. We did an extended feature in our June survey published yesterday. And using these year-on-year percentage change quarterly forecasts for the next 7 quarters, we also took historical levels and we indexed for all our countries at 100 equals Q4 2019. And we extrapolated sort of measures of lost or gained output, which can be seen in a few of these charts here. So the US chart shows that pre-crisis output is not expected to be recaptured by Q4 2021. And the same is evident in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japan's decline is relatively shallow compared to some of these other countries here, but its recovery is shallow also. And it is Italy which has the biggest decline and may struggle to regain output in the years to come. The only major country with positive forecast patterns and which is expected to reach 110% of its 2019 level by Q4 21 is China. And we'll be discussing China in a few minutes. In May, we asked our G7 panel for, their contours of the recovery, like what kind of recovery they expected, whether it be a V-shape immediate recovery or a double dip W or a sort of U-shape more protracted recovery. And perhaps not surprisingly, most did expect a more protracted U-shape rebound. But we've indicated here that our German respondents were actually relatively optimistic and assigned a 35.5% probability to a V-shaped or more immediate recovery. And this may reflect on their relatively successful handling of the pandemic thus far. In this next slide here, we wanted to consider the outlook for China and various emerging economies. And so we've just set out some of our regional groupings and their respective weightings here. But it's the next exhibit which may give you an idea of world and regional aggregates of consensus forecast GDP growth by region. It shows the weighted averages of these consensus forecasts, and it is clear that for some of these regions, specifically Asia-Pacific, to a lesser extent Eastern Europe, they are expected to see shallower declines in 2020 and more rapid recoveries in 2021. And indeed, the final column shows the sum of their 2020 and 2021 forecast. And as you can see, Asia-Pacific is one of the regions, or perhaps the only region, which is showing a gain on that loss of output in 2020. And indeed, we've seen some better growth forecasts for 2021 for countries such as China, Indonesia, South Korea, Poland, Turkey, erasing a lot of the sharp declines of 2020. There's been a number of debates over the quality of statistics, not just in the public health arena, but also in the economics data field. And it raises a question about whether some of this information or data has been politicized. In collecting data for Argentine inflation between 2012 and 2015, we found that our Argentine panel, largely homegrown, were more than ready to provide tentative true estimates of CPI at a time when the officially reported index was underreporting the rate of inflation. Their forecasts were about 70% higher than the official data. Moreover, Chinese data has had its drawbacks too, lacking in some of the comprehensive expenditure-based components that we might see in some other national accounts. And this has led to some concerns over data quality. In March 2019, the Brookings Institute published this academic paper, which concluded that between 2008 and 2016, official data from the National Statistics Bureau of China overstated Chinese GDP by about 1.7% per annum. China-focused economists have discussed some concerns with us about the alleged smoothing of some quarterly data. It makes us wonder if target setting from the top-down administrative system may be part of the issue. Being data people, we do have an interest in this area, and we would welcome hearing from others because clearly good forecasts strive for accuracy and deserve well-measured outturns to strive for. We also collect longer-term forecasts as part of our work, and these charts here show rolling 6 to 10-year consensus forecasts for GDP in blue and consumer price inflation in red. And if you look at the United States chart, which is first up, we show these aggregated sort of rolling averages. There's an upswing sort of between in the 90s and the early 2000s, and this was the sort of impact of the productivity and IT revolution, which raised growth rates, potential growth rates, and standards of living. And then just about 2004, 2005, 2006 began the beginning of this decline, where potential growth rates for a number of countries actually dropped in some cases by half. And this, in a way, precedes Lawrence Summers' secular stagnation analysis by a couple of years. And even China, which is the next chart over, continues this decline in future growth expectations from a high of 8% to 4.5% more recently. And this is due in part to demographic issues, namely an aging population, which has been exacerbated by previous one-child policies. Elsewhere in Asia, and perhaps not just in Asia, but also is an issue that crops up in Europe as well, we have the issue of declining birth rates. So it's not just an aging population, but declining birth rates, which impacts especially a country like Japan, which at one time had plus 2% growth expectations, which have recently dropped to closer to 0.6% in recent times. So Exhibit 16 looks at exploding government budget deficits as a percent of GDP. And as the pandemic has spread, it's forced government or policymakers into two broad actions. And one has been, of course, the shutdown in activity and restricted movement to reduce the transmission of disease, essentially self-sabotaging economies in order to protect the health, well-being of citizens. And the second has been to turn on the fiscal and monetary taps. And government spending has been used not to try and reboot economic activity, as in maybe the 2008 financial crisis, but to actually just contain the worst of this economic crisis and the pandemic's impact. Governments cannot fix the problem. So the budget deficits that we show here for the countries, we show forecasts taken in March, April, May, and June, and you can just see the progressive worsening of expectations for budgets. And it's not surprising, given that these come on the back of government rescue packages. These charts show that the United States budget deficit outstrips them all. And it also raises the question about whether financing these deficits will become a major challenge in the years going forward. So if you cast your mind back to the 2008 financial crisis and the aftermath, in about 2011, there was a sort of European debt crisis where markets reacted to economies like Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and others, felt that they had accrued a massive fiscal burden and that growth was just too weak to really cover that financing. And therefore, these debt burdens had become, in the market's view, unsustainable. And the reaction was to force or impose austerity measures on many of these economies to clean up their public financing. And indeed, by some counts, pre-crisis or pre-2011 GDP levels of output have never recovered for a country like Greece or Italy. This next chart looks at how spending has been allocated across a series of countries. The gray bars are below the line fiscal measures. So these are loans which are ostensibly expected to be paid back, in theory. And the orange bars are revenue and expenditure measures, which are gifted measures, really, and there is no payback. So if you look at the US one, they have slightly more orange gifted measures versus gray loan measures. And that reflects on their CARES Act, the $1,200 disbursement to citizens. They don't expect that to be paid back. In Japan, it's a more 50-50 approach, and it is European governments which have weighted their rescue packages more towards loans. The collapse in aggregate demand, which we've illustrated in previous exhibits, has also weighed on inflation expectations. And we show here some of the quarterly expectations for CPI for a number of countries. A lot of our panelists were predicting heavy deflationary environments to come over the course of 2020, pardon me, maybe going even into 2021. And it's not really surprising, again, that in an environment of reduced consumer demand, income uncertainty, layoffs, social distancing, that inflation is expected to react in such a way. Central banks have cut rates to encourage borrowing and spending, and there's always the question of whether excessive monetary stimulus will eventually cause reinflation. Now I'm going to hand you back to Philip to talk about significant challenges and risks.
Thank you, Claire. We're a survey firm compiling the estimates of other economists. We have, of course, our own views as to some of the larger risks and challenges which confront the major economies. These include those listed below, and you can see they range from public health fears in number 1, authoritarian governments, increasing their apparent power worldwide. Thirdly, the polarization and radical political discourse in Western democracies. US election is coming up on November the 3rd, Germany and Japan in 2021. Fourth, climate change, world population gains with large increases still expected by the United Nations going toward 2050. Government debt loads were flagged by the New York Times and other publications as being a risk. Inflationary potential, if we're flooding the main countries with a tremendous amount of stimulus in the way of monetary funds, will we have to suffer from significant inflation and perhaps higher interest rates at a later stage? So there's quite a range of these different kinds of issues and problems. These challenges may discourage business investment, may encourage the expansions in the role of government, and may lead households to cut spending and undertake more precautionary saving. They may also combine to deepen individual country depressions, as they did in the 1930s and 40s. Economists are hoping that medical research will develop vaccines or other products which can begin to confront the disease, but we need to be realistic at the same time. That's the end of our remarks. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you, Paul, Phil, and Claire for that. This is Victor from Refinitiv. I'm an ICON specialist, and I'll show you how to access some of the consensus economics content within the ICON Datastream terminal. Consensus Economic offers over 60,000 global series, and its history goes back to 1980s. Refinitiv offers the full Consensus Economics full forecast, as well as the long-term forecast, and also the free-to-access content, the mean forecast. To access the collection on ICON's Datastream, on the top left of your toolbar, simply type in DS chart. And then from the drop-down menu, select the Chart Studios, which will open up the Datastream charting application. The charting application is a very powerful tool that allows you to apply mathematics to your data, as well as quickly extract the content to Excel, and even embed the charts as refreshable into your Microsoft Office suite. Once you land on the chart, you'll automatically open up an existing chart. To create a new chart, on the top left is a blank piece of paper. Clicking on that piece of paper in yellow will open up a new chart. In the empty line 1, you can start to type in the series, or following that line one right underneath is a little arrow to jump into the new series search, which will open up the Datastream Navigator. The Datastream Navigator is a very powerful symbol searching tool. Within the Navigator, there's actually two simple ways to find the consensus economics content. The first is relatively to simply type in on the top left, consensus economics, and press the search button on the top middle. Once the results are showcased, leverage the refined search, which are displayed on the left, to search for the category or filter of the category economics, and then under source, consensus economics. There's further filters to select specific markets or regions, as well as frequency of content. Within the body of the Navigator, you'll showcase the top 15 results, and as you hover your mouse over these results, the metadata or the profile of that series will display underneath. If you wish to see more content on the top right, highlighted in a yellow arrow with a white box, is the ability to view additional content or export everything to Excel. The second way to access the consensus economic data is to jump from the Navigator's Explorer tree. On the top left, click on Explorer, which will open up the entire tree, and then select your specific asset class of focus, economics. In the subcategory, jump into international forecasts and surveys. There, you'll see the three collections from consensus economics. If you toggle or click into each of those, you'll see specific regions of focus or countries of focus, and you can select on those. If anyone's interested in the fee liable content, please reach out to your consensus economics representative. If anyone's interested in the ICON Datastream, of course, please reach out to Refinitiv. Again, this is Victor Tyke. Thanks for giving me the time to display some of the content within our product. And I'll pass this back to Paul, Phil, and Claire for the Q&A.
Excellent. Thanks, Victor. We'll just leave that up on the screen there while we go through some questions. There's been quite a few that's come in, Philip. So the first one that I spotted was, first of all, about your panelists. I think one of your first slides, you had a list of panelists. How do you select your panelists?
Right. We select them with great care, I suppose, is the first part of that question. Now, we're looking for panelists who can work with us on a consistent basis, because we want them to come in and provide us with their estimates each month. And we want panelists who can be comprehensive in terms of the variables that they cover. So economists with reputations is also very helpful. If an economist has a reputation for having worked in this industry for a long time, then he probably has those elements of consistency and comprehensiveness that we're looking for. We also tend to vet our economists if they approach us and ask to join our panels by asking to see their research. I suppose finally, another quality that we're looking for is their independence. So we don't include, as you probably noticed within our panels, government economists or people with a tremendous amount of obligation toward their governments. We're looking for people who truly will look at economic data announcements, and make their own judgments as to what their forecast should be.
Okay. And I guess the one that sort of links to that one is how do you select the variables that you ask your panelists to forecast on? I guess some of them are fairly straightforward, but obviously you have a lot of questions you ask.
Sure. No, we have obviously the main variables, and we're looking for variables that do have an element of comparability across countries, because people wish to compare the forecast for Italy with those of Germany. And so we will try to have variables that are similar or the same in each country. The national statistics offices of the individual countries, however, produce their own sets of data. and weight it and develop it and do the mathematics on it and sourcing on it in different ways. And so obtaining cross-country comparability is not always possible, but we try to encourage people to do that, and we have an ongoing dialogue with our panelists. When they suggest new variables to us, we consider them. But in fact, the situation is that these variables tend to fall in place and then stay for long periods of time. And we, in fact, have in our user guides something we call a record of changes to variables, which we keep at the back of each user guide. And so for each country, we're able to see if a country has changed its variable. Yes, Japan in the 1990s changed the way they compute their current account deficit, current account surplus, from doing it in US dollars, billions, to doing it in trillions of yen. But this is the exception because countries realize that statistics users appreciate the consistency of the definitions of variables over time, and they tend to remain over time pretty much the same. This is very helpful to us, obviously, in our work, and helpful to our users as they try to look at changes to expectations over time.
Okay, good, thank you. So some of the questions that have come in, and we've had a few, so we'll go through these relatively quickly, if that's okay. So how does your projections incorporate future fiscal stimulus, or do you assume zero new stimulus?
Yes, I think we leave it to each panelist to consider the stimulus that they consider likely. And pretty clearly, as we were coming up to our March and April surveys this year, for example, we found stimulus bills discussed within the US Congress and eventually signed by the president. And so the sequence of those events was taken into account by the panelists. And so we saw this increasing pattern in one of the slides of growing estimates of budget deficits. And so as the stimulus projects were debated, were agreed, and were signed into law, and then began to result in government disbursements, those were factored into panelists' forecasts. And so we really actually leave it to them. We don't try to prescribe the assumptions that we want them to use in advance. We leave it to them to assess what's happening in their individual countries and to try to, in some cases, evaluate the fast-breaking news in these kinds of areas.
Okay. Good. So there was a question actually on the Italian data around the picture about one of the slowest recoveries. The question was, is this down to tourism or the lack of tourism at the moment there, or other impacts?
Yes, I think certainly tourism is a significant item for Italy in terms of its total GDP. It's a wonderful tourist destination, and it receives a lot of tourist revenues each year. Clearly, the problems for transportation industries and for social distancing have probably impacted the service industries like tourism in Italy more than they've impacted manufacturing businesses, although those too have been impacted in Italy and of course, other countries. So I think the tourism problems in Italy are part of that. Also, there must be a question longer term about the sustainability of this kind of situation as long as the pandemic continues. Obviously, we would expect a change shortly thereafter. The other factor that's here is that Italy has had a very slow rate of growth over the last 10, 15 years. So there is a tradition of slower growth, if you will. And this is an important factor also.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. So I think the last question we have is, really, can you explain why the China, Asia Pacific GDP output estimates are positive? Slower world GDP through 2021 should limit their potential to export and grow.
No question about it. China and the other Asian exporting countries are very dependent upon exports. No question about it. But I think that there definitely is, there are two factors here. One is a sense of optimism that they can surmount these difficulties and that they're going to see the problem through, as it were. In the second mention of my discussion of significant challenges, the second line of that is the following phrase: China has forgotten about the virus already, which comes from the New York Times. It's a headline in the New York Times a few days ago. And so there definitely is an effort on the part of governments in some of these countries to push past the problem and to encourage people to return to work. The other factor in here that touches on the importance of exports is that if you look at the connection of exports in relation to other activities in these economies, you'll find that in China, the exports have been a steadily declining portion of their total GDP. I can't give you the exact current figure, whether it's 5 or 10%, but it's no longer 20 or 30%. It's declined significantly as China has emphasized in their government policy and in their other areas of activity the importance of growth in Chinese domestic demand. And so there's been Chinese construction. There's been Chinese consumer goods. There's been Chinese tourism. There's been a whole range of other things which have endeavored to create within China a consumer society. And this has impacted the role of exports in China.
Excellent. Thank you, Philip. Well, that looks like that's all of the questions that we've got coming. So it leads me now to thank you, Philip, Claire, and Victor. A really interesting session and really great to hear your insight and to learn more about this content set. And also great for you to share your hot off the press forecast that I think only came out today or yesterday.